Let's welcome in Pepper Bryars. Pepper, what's going on, man?
Hey, how you doing? How you doing?
Pepper, if you weren't awake by now, I know that song woke you up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's on my alarm radio in the morning.
Oh, yeah. So, Pepper, you wrote a story about 5 days ago, and the title of it was "The Bigot Went Down to Bama. Are racist opinions acceptable topics for discussion?" Now, in your email this morning, you said that this event didn't actually happen, but it was planned and it got canceled. Why did it get canceled?
Yeah, well, it was planned for Thursday night, and I was really looking forward to it because I know this is for students down there on campus, but I was actually considering loading up the car and driving down there because I wanted to take this guy on. The more and more I read about him and listened to him on YouTube, the more I wanted to take him down, or at least see a student there in Tuscaloosa take him down. So
yeah.
let me walk you back a little bit. So here's what happened. It's a little-known student group there on campus, and I'd say an ill-advised one at that, invited a writer named Jared Taylor to come down there and give a talk on campus. Now, Taylor describes himself as a race realist. And okay, so what is that? Well, it's kind of a modern version of how racists used to use the story of Ham from Genesis. Ham looked upon Noah in his nakedness, and when Noah woke up, he cursed his son Canaan and all of his descendants to be servants. Well, for centuries, in fact, racists used that story to justify racism. They said, okay, those ones who are cursed were the blacks, and that justified slavery. And I know that sounds completely ridiculous, and it almost sounds like I'm making it up, but it's actually true. People used to believe that garbage. So along comes Jared Taylor. Now he's a educated guy, Ivy League educated guy. So he kind of does the same thing. He says, no, the differences between white people, black people, outcomes, and all that has nothing to do with culture and education and opportunity and all that. It's genetic. It is built in. He said that there are genetic differences that make blacks inferior, and conversely make whites and Asians superior. So he calls himself a race realist for facing what he calls are facts. And I and pretty much anybody else who has since calls him, an ignorant racist, a hateful racist for those. It's almost like, in a way, eugenics. So anyway, this group invites him down to give a talk. And University of Alabama, they say, well, we don't agree with what this person says, but, they're not going to act like these snowflake coddling institutions and disinvite people. They say, hey, this group followed the processes. They're a student registered group, and we're going to let him come on campus, and there's going to be a free exchange. Now, in the days that followed, turns out that group wasn't actually in accord with the rules. I believe they lacked a faculty advisor. So they were, in essence, not a registered student group. So Alabama said,
who was this group, Pepper?
Well, it's important to know. I think they were called America First. It's important to know that, as with most racist organizations, their bark is much louder than their bite. It's probably a half a dozen kids, if that.
Yeah.
So it's not this big, huge group over there. It's probably half a dozen kids. They could not even muster the strength to get themselves in accord with the regulations. And the university gave them a second chance, before they canceled it. And they said, hey, if you can get in line with regulations, we'll let your event proceed. They could not get in line with the regulations, and thus the event was canceled. But again, I was disappointed because everything to date with this guy coming down looked great. He has an awful message. Let's drag it out into the light of day and show people how ugly it is. The university responded correctly by saying we're not going to censor his speech. The Crimson and White, the university newspaper over there, wrote an editorial saying, hey, this is disgusting what he has to say, but let's counter his message with, and because the only solution for hate speech is more speech. It's not to censor it. So, I was hoping for a really good moment down there, but, the university should be commended. The students should be commended. But unfortunately, it's not, or fortunately, it's depending upon your point of view, it's not happening.
So the guy's name was Jared Taylor, who was going to come down. What's Jared Taylor's background? So, Zach and I were just talking about this.
Yeah.
How do you describe yourself as a white supremacist or a bigot or a racist and want to come talk to college students and kind of take the opposite approach? Do you think it's actually what he believes, or do you think it's clickbait?
No, he actually believes this. He has a long history going back, over 20 years. He runs the center, I forget the name of it, but a magazine called, I believe, The Resistance. It's, we have racists in our world, and some of them are, pretty dumb, and some of them are pretty intelligent, like Jared Taylor. Again, he has some pretty impressive degrees behind him, and he presents his arguments in in a methodical manner, but it's all just trash. I mean, going and saying that there is something genetically different about a black child and a white child, that no matter how they're brought up, no matter what culture they're brought up, they're going to be different. And that's just stupid. I mean, race doesn't matter. Culture matters. Culture is what is important here. The differences between, what cultures value, even groups within a culture. Some value education, some don't. The group that values education is going to perform better than the group that doesn't. It has nothing to do with race.
So in your article, you say that censorship robs an individual of ideas about that censor. So when you say censorship in this kind of terms, you're saying that if we censor what Jared Taylor has to say, then maybe someone never hears that, and so they don't know the rebuttal to someone in everyday life if they hear that.
Right, and this is especially important on campus. There should be nothing off the table of conversation on a university setting. But unfortunately, across the United States, there is. There are speakers, moderate speakers, in fact, not wild ones like Jared Taylor, but moderate speakers like Ben Shapiro will come on the campus, and campuses will they'll freak out. Administrations will bar him from speaking on campus, or only allow him to speak at a satellite campus, like down at their ag school out on the county road or something like that. It's absurd, and it does. I mean, when you censor speech, when you say, okay, this is outside the current window of acceptable thought or acceptable discussion. Okay, the censor has consumed that information because he's the one who's telling somebody else that they can't. So what that censor is doing is robbing them of the information. It's a very paternalistic way to view things. So they're going to come and say, we're going to shield your mind from this because, we can handle it, but, you can't. So it does a particularly a bad thing culturally because the Jared Taylors of the world are out there, okay? And if he came to these conclusions, then that must mean that there are others that came to the conclusions, and then even more so, many others who are close to it, or who may lend like half their ear to that argument, and they kind of believe it. That's why it's so important to say, oh, no. We have to drag this out into the light of day and show people exactly what he's saying, and then refute it point by point by point. There was a reason why back when the Klan, had actually, members over a dozen, that they held rallies at night and wore hoods. You can't talk about this with a straight face in the light of day without appearing to be exactly what it is, a very ugly, ignorant thing.
So, Pepper, do you think that the University of Alabama will ever have Jared Taylor there on campus, or do you think this niche group missed their shot, per se, to have him down there?
And also kind of begging off that, would someone like him coming, at the end of the day, do you think, should we really censor everything that comes into a college campus if it's worth having discussion? Or should, and I'm not for this at all, coming to university, someone that's so swayed, but at the same time, I do think that we do need to hear all people out, and that's kind of the beauty of this country. Do you think that there should be, more people like this coming into classrooms and just talking, because there's always worth for discussion.
Well, I think I think University of Alabama should be commended on this. I mean, they made a very difficult decision that said,
Right.
We have somebody coming down who's saying some really ignorant, hateful things, and he's saying them in a way, using science and his fancy Ivy League degree to sound persuasive. So it's a dangerous mix when you have a bad idea and a decent presenter, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think it was courageous to say no. We're going to bite the bullet on this one. We're an institution of higher learning, and we're going to invite them out, but we're going to have an open debate on it, which means we're going to have the other side of the argument make its argument known as well. But in the end, they didn't have to deal with the mess that situation would actually result in the end, or at least the having to deal with a very controversial debate. So I think they were tested and they passed the test. So should we expect the University of Alabama to allow its students to hear controversial opinions on campus? Yes, I think we can. They just passed the test by having, by potentially allowing that. Now, other institutions around the country are failing that every day, and not just with. I mean, you could almost half agree with somebody agree with the university saying, "Okay, Jared Taylor, you can't speak," but they're banning very rational, moderate people from coming on campus, saying very normal things that 10 years ago would not have been controversial at all. So, it's a fine line, but everybody, if your schools should be able to, control who comes on campus, no doubt about that. But if you purport to want to educate, our next generation, I want them to know. I want the young people out there to know about these ideas. I want them to know the details of them.
Yeah.
And I want them to be able to knock them down when they hear them. I don't want them to be surprised.
Not be scared, not be taken up by some statement that's made that they'd never heard of. Now, one more thing before we have to hit break here, Pepper. Did this not happen last year with the white supremacist that came to Auburn? Am I?
Yes, yes. Richard Spencer, and Auburn tried to block him from coming. Right, I believe that was so, and it went down to a judge down in Montgomery, and the judge in Montgomery said, "Well, no, you have to go up to." They kind of, sort of, I would give them a C- on that. Because they ended up doing it, but it was pretty nasty show. There was a couple of fist fights out in front of it, and the guy Richard Spencer, again, it was great to have him there because the students got to hear his speech, and it was pretty lousy. So, again, drag them out in the daylight and let everybody see what they're like.
Well, and remember, that was the biggest thing on Twitter, and they were live streaming and everything. They were just kind of showing people outside, and then Auburn students took it one step further and started making funny signs instead of actually being there to be against them. It was kind of funny, but I just remember that's how they acted last year. Pepper Bryars, thanks so much for coming on, Pepper, editor of Yellowhammer News. Pepper, we'll talk to you next week, 12:30.
Looking forward to it.